They called her the ghost, the broken thing. The girl left behind in the dust when the storm passed, but she wasn't a thing. She was flesh and bone, a heart that still beat, and a silence that screamed louder than any curse. Her name was Ilara, but no one in this town had used it in years. It was a word they'd buried, along with her dignity. They saw only the stain of her blood, the shadow of her people, and the shame of the man who'd cast her aside. A young woman of 24, with hair like a starless night and eyes that held the hard, cold memory of fire turned to ash. She moved through their streets like a phantom, hauling laundry for a few cents, drawing water from the well that the other women would abandon the moment she approached. The town's poison dripped down from the parents to the children who would stop their games to giggle and point, their laughter not innocent, but sharp and cruel, a lesson learned at the dinner table. The women watched her with suspicion, as if she carried a plague in the folds of her worn skirt. The men, they'd just look away, their gaze darting to the ground, a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any insult. They didn't want to be seen showing an ounce of kindness. It was too expensive a currency in a town built on judgment. And she bore it, shoulders straight, back unbent. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Because the man who did this to her, the man who'd promised her everything, was still here. William, the saloon owner's son, with his polished boots that crunched on the dusty boardwalk and a smile as easy and empty as a bottle of cheap whiskey. He had courted her in the shadows, his whispers full of promises of a future, of belonging. He'd brought her ribbons for her hair, pressed her hand in the darkness behind the stables, making her believe that the world could finally, for once, open its arms to her. Then the whispers started about him, the laughter in his father's saloon. Him, taking up with a half-breed girl. The pressure mounted, the eyes of the town pressing down on him, and he folded. He broke. It happened in the middle of the town square, on a blindingly hot afternoon. He saw her walking towards him, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought he would stand tall. Instead, as the laughter of his friends rose around him, he looked at her hand, the one he'd held so tenderly just the night before, and he pulled his own away, as if her skin had burned him. He didn't just let go. He recoiled, a look of disgust on his face, and joined the laughter. He made her shame his shield. From that day forward, she was nothing. The abandoned one. A ghost doomed to haunt the edges of their world. The nights were the worst. From her tiny, cold room above the livery stable, she could hear the life of the town she was barred from. The warm glow of lanterns in happy homes, the soft murmur of couples walking arm in arm, the faint, cheerful strum of a guitar from the very saloon owned by the father of the man who had destroyed her. She would lie awake and wonder if the world would ever give her back her name. She had no idea that in those hours, when she was most invisible, someone was watching. He was a cowboy, older than her by a decade, a man whose face was a roadmap of long trails and hard suns. His name was Silas. He wasn't a man carved by cruelty, but by a deep, holding silence. He'd been a quiet fixture in this town for years, drifting in and out, never staying long, never causing a stir. But he saw her. He saw everything. He saw the tremble in her hands as she hauled a water bucket that was too heavy. He saw the way she stacked more firewood than a woman her size should be able to carry. He saw how she kept her head down, but her gaze was never truly defeated. It was just waiting. Unlike the others, he didn't look away. When he passed her in the market, he would give a slow, deliberate nod. A small gesture, worth nothing and yet meaning everything. It was an acknowledgement, a sign that he saw a person, not a ghost. One sweltering afternoon, the handle on a rusty bucket broke, slicing her palm open. Blood welled up, dark against her skin. Before she could even react, he was there. He didn't say a word. He just took her tattered leather glove, pulled a small needle and thread from his saddlebag, and began to stitch the tear with quiet, efficient movements. He mended her glove, right there in the middle of the street, while the town watched, their whispers buzzing like angry flies. He handed it back, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second, and walked away. She accepted it in a stunned silence. That night, she didn't hear the music from the saloon. She sat in her room, pressing the mended glove to her chest, feeling the solid, sturdy stitches beneath her fingers. It felt like a lifeline, a single thread of humanity in a world that had offered her none. His small act of kindness did not go unnoticed. The town's gossip machine churned, spinning new theories, winding them around her like a spider's web. Some said she'd put a spell on the quiet cowboy. Others sneered that he must just pity her, the poor, broken thing. They were all wrong. He didn't see a curse, and he didn't see weakness. He saw a strength that would have shattered lesser people. He saw a survivor. And he was waiting for the right moment. That moment came on an evening when the sky was bruised purple and black with an approaching storm. Ilara couldn't stand the confines of her room, the sound of the town, the weight of her own skin. She walked, her feet carrying her beyond the last flickering lanterns of the town, to the creek that cut through the prairie. The water slid over stones as smooth and dark as glass. She sank to the damp grass, the cool earth a small comfort, and finally, she let go. The fire she'd banked for so long, the rage and the sorrow, it broke free. Not in a scream, but in quiet, trembling sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. It was a sound of absolute heartbreak, a sound not meant for anyone in the world to hear. But someone did. Heavy bootsteps on the soft earth. She froze, her entire body rigid with dread. It was a man. She expected a jeer, a harsh command to move on, another dose of the town's casual cruelty. But the presence that settled near her wasn't threatening. It was just steady. It was the cowboy. Silas. He didn't stand over her, a looming shadow. He knelt, the ground groaning softly under his weight. He just stayed there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, giving her the choice to look up or to stay hidden behind her hands. When she didn't move, he finally spoke. His voice was low, rough, like old leather, but it cut through the sound of the rushing creek and the rising wind. "Pack your things," he said. And then he added the words that would change everything. "You're mine now." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. They weren't thrown at her like a brand, a mark of ownership. They were spoken like a vow, not a claim on her body, but a claim on her struggle, a promise of refuge, a line drawn in the dust of her miserable existence. Her hands fell away from her face, slow and trembling. Her eyes, red-rimmed and raw, stared at him, trying to make sense of the man kneeling before her. He looked like he was carved from the very rock and dust of the prairie, unmovable. For years she had been told, in 1,000 different ways, that she was worthless, unwanted, unseen. And now this man, this quiet, steady stranger, was looking at her as if she were the only person in the world, as if he'd been searching for her. Disbelief was a physical thing, clinging to her like a shroud. She couldn't reconcile the kindness in his eyes with the cruelty she had known her whole life. The two things couldn't exist in the same world. A question escaped her lips, barely a whisper, a shiver of sound. "Why me?" The wind picked up, rustling the reeds along the creek bank, and her question just hung there, raw and desperate. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her, though her hand lay on the grass just inches from his. He just held her gaze, and she had the sudden, terrifying feeling that her entire future, her very survival, depended on her answer to a question he hadn't even asked. Could she trust this? Could she step out of the shadows that had become her only home into the fragile, uncertain light of this man's promise? She didn't know it yet, but he wasn't offering her a new life. He was offering her a weapon, and the war was just beginning. She packed. It didn't take long. A spare dress, the mended glove, and the crushing weight of her past were all she owned. She followed him out of town under the cover of a moonless, storm-heavy sky. No one saw them leave. If they had, it wouldn't have mattered. She was already a ghost to them. Her disappearance would be nothing more than a ghost fading into the dark. They rode for hours, the rumble of distant thunder chasing them across the plains. As dawn threatened to break, they arrived. The cabin wasn't grand. It was a small, sturdy structure made of dark timber that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. It stood against the vast, open prairie, a solitary bastion against the wind and the emptiness. Smoke was already curling from its stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the bruised dawn sky. It smelled of cedar and burning oak. Inside, a fire was already crackling in the hearth. The single room was sparse but meticulously clean. A worn but comfortable-looking bed in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center, and shelves stocked with provisions. It was a place of quiet order, of purpose. It was the complete opposite of her life. For the first time in years, she breathed air that didn't taste of judgment. The 4 walls around her didn't feel like a cage closing in. They felt like a shield. Silas moved with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm, like a man who was never surprised by anything. He unsaddled his horse, checking every strap and buckle with a practiced eye. He spoke very little, but when he did, each word seemed to be measured, weighed for its necessity before being spoken. He didn't give her orders. He didn't ask her questions. He simply set a plate of bread and jerky on the table, pointed to a water barrel, and then went about his chores, leaving a wide, silent space for her to exist in. At first, she stayed at the very edges of that space, a nervous bird ready to take flight. She expected his patience to wear thin, for the quiet kindness to curdle into the familiar resentment she knew from everyone else. But it never did. Day after day, his demeanor remained as steady and unchanging as the northern star. He was a constant, a rock, and she, who had lived her life on shifting sands, found the stillness of him both terrifying and deeply compelling. She started to notice the small things, details that would have been invisible in the harsh glare of the town. She saw the way he fed his horse before he ever took a bite of his own food. She saw him pause after a long ride to gently rub the ears of his old, dusty dog. His hands were a paradox, scarred, calloused, and rough from years of hard work, yet they moved with an impossible gentleness when he handled a coffee pot or stacked firewood. That gentleness was a key to a lock she didn't even know she possessed. Cruelty, she understood. She had built walls against it, thick and high. But this quiet, unassuming kindness, it found the cracks. It unsettled her. It asked for a trust she hadn't given to another soul since William had shattered it in the town square. Slowly, tentatively, she began to let it in. Life on the prairie was isolated, but not entirely lonely. A few days after she arrived, a widow named Martha from a homestead a few miles away came by. Her eyes were curious, but held no condemnation. She brought a loaf of bread, still warm from her oven, and talked about the coming rains and the health of her cattle. She never once mentioned the town or the whispers. She just talked, woman to woman, and left with a simple, "You're welcome here." A few days later, a young boy, no more than 8, wandered up from the town, his eyes wide with a shameless wonder. He just stood at the edge of the trees, staring at her. She braced herself for the usual taunts, the cruel words of his parents repeated in a child's high-pitched voice. Instead, the boy just said, "You look like the pictures in the storybooks my grandma reads, the ones about warrior women." Before she could respond, he turned and ran off, a flash of denim and bare feet disappearing back towards the town. He hadn't left mockery in his wake. He'd left awe. For the first time, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt like she'd been seen in the light. But the past has a long reach. It doesn't let go easily. Word of her new life inevitably slithered back to town, right into the ears of William. The news that the girl he'd discarded, the half-breed ghost, had found refuge with the quiet cowboy ignited a sour, ugly fire in his gut. It wasn't love or regret, it was pride. A bruised, pathetic pride. How dare she find a life after he had decreed she shouldn't have one? On a night when the sky was torn open by a violent thunderstorm, he rode out to the cabin. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain lashed down in blinding sheets. He didn't knock. He hammered on the door with his fists, the sound as sharp and violent as gunfire. Silas opened the door, the lantern in his hand casting long, dancing shadows. William stood there, soaked and snarling, his face twisted with whiskey and rage. "Get her out here," he spat, his words thick and slurred. "She doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong anywhere." Alara stood in the shadows near the hearth, her heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against her ribs. This was it, the moment she had always feared. The moment when the world's violence would finally catch up to her. She expected Silas to reach for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. She expected a brutal fight, the clash of fists, the language of wounded male pride that she knew so well. But Silas didn't move towards the gun. He just stood there, a bulwark against the storm, both outside and in the doorway. His voice, when it came, was dangerously low and steady, carrying more weight than the thunder that cracked overhead. "She's already claimed," he said, his eyes locked on William's. And then he delivered the blow. By dignity, by her own choice. He paused, letting the words sink in. And by me. The words weren't a boast. They were a statement of fact, as solid and unchangeable as the mountains on the horizon. They cut through William's drunken bravado like a razor. The sneer on his face faltered, his bluster collapsing under the sheer, unshakable certainty in Silas's voice. He stammered, tried to find another insult, but the words wouldn't come. He was a man undone by his own weakness, exposed in the lantern light for the coward he truly was. He stumbled backward, turned, and retreated into the storm, swallowed by the darkness he had brought with him. When Silas shut the door, the silence that fell in the cabin was a living thing. It trembled with unspoken words, with the storm still raging outside, with the frantic beating of Alara's heart. The fire crackled, the rain hammered on the roof, but the only sound she could truly hear was the ragged sound of her own breathing. She had waited for this moment her entire life. Not for a man to save her, but for someone to simply stand beside her and declare that she was worthy of being defended, worthy of being chosen. She found herself trembling, not from fear, but from the release of a pressure she had carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She turned to Silas, who was watching the fire, his expression unreadable. Her voice, when she found it, was quiet, but it broke the heavy silence. "Why me?" It was the same question she'd asked at the creek, but this time it wasn't born of disbelief. It was a genuine plea to understand. He finally turned his gaze from the flames to her. His eyes were steady, clear, and held not a single shred of hesitation. "Because I saw you," he said simply, when the whole world chose not to. He looked back at the fire, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "And because I was waiting." The words sent a tremor through her. "I'll wait again," he added, his voice dropping even lower. "Every day, if I have to." Her eyes flooded with tears, but for the first time in her life, they weren't tears of shame or sorrow. They were a storm of disbelief and a desperate, burgeoning hope. She pressed her hands together as if trying to physically hold the weight of his words. No one had ever spoken of waiting for her. No one had ever spoken as if her existence was a blessing, not a burden. As the storm outside began to fade, a new, quieter storm was raging inside her. This man, this stranger, had seen through the ghost and found the woman. But as she looked around the meticulously kept cabin, A sudden cold thought pierced through her gratitude. Everything was too perfect, too clean, too prepared. A drifter, a simple cowboy, wouldn't keep a place like this. Her eyes fell on a small hand-carved chest tucked away under the bed. A chest he never opened. A chest she'd never thought to look in. He saw her looking at it. A flicker of something, not fear, but something guarded, passed through his eyes. And in that moment, she realized the truth was far more complicated than a simple rescue. He hadn't just been waiting for her. He had been planning. This quiet cowboy wasn't just a kind soul. He had secrets buried deeper than any grave, and she had just walked right into the middle of them. The dawn came, pale and rain-washed, painting the prairie in shades of silver and gray. The air was clean, stripped of the previous night's violence. They sat on the cabin's threshold, the vast, empty land stretching out before them. An unspoken tension hung between them, thicker than the morning mist. Silas's promise from the night before echoed in her mind, but now it was tangled with a new, unsettling suspicion. Who was this man? Really? Why had he truly been waiting for her? While Silas was out checking the fence line, a gnawing curiosity finally overwhelmed her caution. Her hands trembled as she knelt and pulled the small, carved wooden chest from under the bed. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were not the belongings of a lonely cowboy. There was a woman's silver locket, tarnished with age. A small, pressed flower, its color long faded to a ghostly white. And underneath it all, a single child-sized moccasin, intricately beaded in a pattern she recognized. A pattern her mother used to sew. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized her. She picked up the locket. Her fingers, clumsy with shock, fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. Inside were two miniature portraits. One was of a handsome, smiling man she didn't know. The other was of a woman with kind eyes and familiar dark hair. It was her mother, years younger, but unmistakably her. Ilara felt the floor tilt beneath her. The air rushed from her lungs. This wasn't a stranger's cabin. This was a shrine. When Silas returned, he found her sitting on the floor, the open chest before her, the locket clutched in her white-knuckled fist. He didn't look surprised. He just looked weary, as if he'd been carrying a heavy weight for a very long time and had finally reached his destination. "You knew her," Ilara whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You knew my mother." Silas closed the cabin door, the soft click echoing the finality of a closing trap. He knelt down in front of her, his expression a mixture of sorrow and a grim, unyielding resolve. "I knew both your parents, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet. "The man in that locket, he was my brother." The story came tumbling out, a torrent of secrets held back for more than 15 years. Silas and his brother Daniel had been prospectors. They had stumbled upon the richest gold vein this side of the mountains, a secret they shared with only one other man, a trusted friend, Ilara's father. They had a plan to file the claim together, to build a new life for all their families. But someone else found out, William's father, Corcoran. Back then, he was just a failed prospector with a greedy heart and a black soul. Corcoran wanted the claim. He couldn't take it legally, so he took it with blood. He orchestrated what the town later called an Apache raid, a convenient story that played on their worst fears and prejudices. But it wasn't a raid. It was a massacre, carried out by hired guns disguised to look like natives. Silas had been away in a nearby town getting supplies. He returned to find a nightmare. His brother, Daniel, was dead. Ilara's father was dead. And Ilara's mother, Corcoran's men had taken her. What happened to her after that, Silas never knew for certain, but he knew Corcoran was responsible for her disappearance. He left a single survivor, a small, terrified girl, Ilara. Corcoran let her live for a reason. A half-breed orphan girl would never be believed. She would be a living symbol of the savage raid, a constant reminder to the town of the official story. Her misery was the cornerstone of Corcoran's lie, a lie that allowed him to steal the claim, build his saloon, and become the most powerful man in the territory. The town's cruelty towards Alara wasn't just random bigotry. It had been carefully cultivated by Corcoran for years. He fed the whispers, stoked the prejudice, ensuring she would always be an outcast, powerless and silenced. He made her a ghost, so she could never testify to the truth of what she'd seen as a child. Silas had been forced to flee, a wanted man himself, framed for the very murders Corcoran had committed. For 15 years, he had lived in the shadows, gathering evidence, waiting for his chance. He had drifted back into town periodically, a ghost of his own, watching Alara from afar, watching Corcoran's empire grow on a foundation of blood and lies, watching William grow into a spoiled, arrogant reflection of his father's evil. "I didn't save you from the creek, Alara," Silas said, his voice thick with a lifetime of grief and rage. "I brought you here because the time for waiting is over. You are the one thing Corcoran's money can't buy and his lies can't erase. You are the living proof of what he did." Alara looked down at the locket, at her mother's smiling face, and the sorrow in her heart began to burn, transforming into something else, something hot and hard and sharp. Fury, the years of shame, of whispered insults, of feeling broken and worthless. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed cage. She wasn't the abandoned one. She was the survivor. She was the witness. She looked up at Silas, and for the first time she saw the truth of him. The quiet steadiness wasn't just patience. It was the coiled stillness of a predator. The lines on his face weren't from the sun. They were carved by a singular burning purpose: revenge. He didn't claim me by dignity or choice, she thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He claimed me as a weapon. She slowly got to her feet, the locket still in her hand. Her own weakness, her own despair, had been the final piece of his plan. He needed her to have nothing left to lose, so she would be willing to fight. "Your words at the creek," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "You're mine now. You weren't offering me a home." "No," Silas admitted, his gaze unflinching. "I was offering you justice. Our justice." He stood up to face her, no longer a gentle protector, but a partner in a deadly pact. "Corcoran thinks you are his greatest secret, the one that keeps his lie safe. But we are going to turn you into the truth that burns his entire world to the ground." A new fire was lit in Alara's eyes, a fire that had been banked under the ashes of her shame for far too long. It was no longer the flickering flame of a victim. It was the white-hot inferno of an avenger. She closed the locket with a decisive snap. The sound echoed in the small cabin like the cocking of a rifle. "Tell me the plan," she said. Their strategy wasn't one of brute force. Corcoran owned the town, the sheriff, everything. A direct accusation would be her word against his, and she knew whose word the town would take. They had to dismantle his empire from the inside out, using the very greed that built it as their weapon. The plan began with a whisper. Silas, using his intimate knowledge of the surrounding territory, knowledge gained from years of prospecting with her father and his brother, knew of several small, worthless gold deposits scattered in the hills. He rode out, and over the course of a week, he salted these sites, carefully planting a few genuine nuggets of gold from a small pouch he'd kept hidden for 15 years. Gold from the original stolen claim. Then he rode into the nearest town, not theirs, but the next one over, and paid for his supplies with one of those nuggets. He made sure to be overheard, muttering about his lucky strike in the hills just west of Corcoran's territory. It was a lit match tossed into a dry field. The news traveled faster than a horse. Within days, a trickle of hopeful prospectors began to arrive, then a stream, then a flood. A mini gold rush, right on Corcoran's doorstep. The sudden influx of people stretched Corcoran's resources. His saloon was overflowing, but so was the tension in the town. The new arrivals were a rough, unpredictable element, not under his control. He grew paranoid, his eyes constantly scanning the hills, his grip on his town suddenly feeling less secure. The next step was Alara's. She began walking into town for supplies, but she was no longer the downcast ghost. She held her head high, a quiet confidence radiating from her. When people whispered, she met their gaze, her eyes holding a silent challenge. She went to the mercantile, run by a man who had always been curt and dismissive. She placed a small but very real gold nugget on the counter. The same kind of gold that was causing all the commotion. The shopkeeper's eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" he stammered. Alara just smiled, a small, mysterious smile. "The land provides for those it remembers," she said, her words cryptic and unsettling. She took her supplies and left, leaving the nugget and a storm of new questions behind her. The whispers about her changed. She wasn't the cursed half-breed anymore. She was the girl who knew something, the girl who had a connection to the gold. The old-timers started to remember stories they'd long forgotten, stories of a rich claim found years ago by a couple of brothers and an Apache man, a claim that had vanished after a suspicious raid. The widow, Martha, came to the cabin again. This time, she didn't just bring bread, she brought a memory. "I remember your mother, Alara," she said, her voice low. "She was my friend. The night she disappeared, she told me she was afraid of Corcoran. She said he had the devil's hunger in his eyes." It was another piece of the puzzle, another crack in Corcoran's carefully constructed dam of lies. The pressure was mounting on Corcoran, but the final piece of the trap was yet to be laid. Silas crafted a fake map, a brilliant piece of forgery showing the location of the mother lode, the source of all the gold. He drew it on aged parchment with faded ink, making it look exactly like the kind of map a prospector would guard with his life. The location it pointed to was a treacherous, unstable canyon known as Devil's Jaw, a place where a planned rock slide could bury a man or an entire group of men forever. They needed to get the map to Corcoran, to let him steal it, and they knew just the man to use: William. Consumed by jealousy and unnerved by the shifting tides of power in town, he was watching them. He saw Silas ride out every morning, saw Alara growing more confident. He was a snake waiting to strike, and they were about to give him the perfect opportunity. One evening, Silas and Alara staged a loud, heated argument just inside the cabin, with the door slightly ajar. Alara accused Silas of being reckless, of risking their secret by flaunting the map. Silas argued back that it was time to cash in, to finally claim what was theirs. It was a piece of theater for an audience of one. They knew William was hiding in the trees, listening to every word. That night, as planned, Silas rode off, making a show of heading in the opposite direction of Devil's Jaw. He left the cabin, and Alara seemingly unprotected. It was the bait. William, believing he was outsmarting them both, broke into the cabin an hour later. He found the map tucked inside an old book just where they wanted him to find it. He snatched it, a triumphant sneer on his face, and rode off into the night to deliver the prize to his father. Corcoran, his greed overriding any caution, fell for it completely. The map confirmed his darkest hopes. He believed Silas had found the original claim. He couldn't risk Silas filing it legally. He had to get there first, and he had to make sure Silas and Alara never spoke of it, or anything else, ever again. He gathered his most loyal, most brutal men, the same kind of men who had ridden with him 15 years ago. As Corcoran and his posse thundered towards Devil's Jaw Canyon, they had no idea they were riding into a perfectly laid trap. Silas wasn't miles away. He was waiting for them, hidden high up on the canyon ridge, his hands resting on a series of levers connected to strategically placed charges of dynamite. But Silas wasn't the only one waiting. After William had left with the map, Ilara had slipped out of the cabin and ridden to the new sheriff's office. The gold rush had brought in a new lawman, a man not on Corcoran's payroll. She told him everything. She showed him her mother's locket. She told him about the massacre, about the stolen claim, about the map leading Corcoran and his gunmen into a trap. At first he was skeptical, but something in her eyes, the undeniable fire of truth, convinced him. He gathered a posse of his own. As Corcoran's men entered the narrowest part of the canyon, Silas pushed the first lever. A massive explosion rocked the canyon walls, sending tons of rock and earth crashing down, sealing the exit behind them. They were trapped. Corcoran and his men, panicked and confused, turned to see the entrance to the canyon was also blocked. High above them, Silas stood silhouetted against the sky. "Looking for this, Corcoran?" he yelled, his voice echoing through the canyon. He held up the real map, the one her father had drawn all those years ago. Corcoran's face went pale with fury and disbelief. He had been played. "It's over," Silas boomed. "Your lies are buried." But Corcoran wasn't a man who surrendered. With a snarl, he drew his pistol. His men followed suit, their guns aimed up at the ridge, but before they could fire, another voice cut through the tense air. "Drop your weapons!" It was the sheriff, appearing at the canyon entrance with his own posse, rifles leveled. Cornered, trapped between the man he'd wronged and the law he thought he owned, Corcoran did the one thing a true coward does. He grabbed the person nearest to him, his own son. He hooked an arm around William's neck, pressing the barrel of his pistol to his son's temple. "Stay back," he screamed, his eyes wild. "I'll kill him. I swear it." William, who had ridden in so triumphantly, was now a trembling, pathetic shield for his monstrous father. And in that moment of ultimate desperation, the dam of Corcoran's lies finally broke. He started ranting, confessing everything in a torrent of furious, self-pitying rage. He admitted to killing Silas's brother, to killing Ilara's father, to stealing the claim, to building his whole life on their graves. "They were weak," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I took what was mine. This land belongs to the strong." From the other end of the canyon, Ilara stepped forward, flanked by 2 deputies. She was no longer a ghost. She was a reckoning. She looked down at the man who had stolen her family, her name, her childhood. "You were never strong, Corcoran," she said, her voice clear and cold, ringing with the authority of absolute truth. "You were just a thief, and now your debt is due." Seeing her, hearing her, something in William finally snapped. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, he slammed his elbow back into his father's gut, breaking his hold. As Corcoran staggered, the sheriff's men surged forward. It was over. Justice hadn't come from the barrel of Silas's gun. It had come from the truth, spoken aloud in a canyon full of witnesses. Corcoran was dragged away in chains, his empire of lies crumbling to dust around him. William was left sobbing in the dirt, a broken man, disowned by his father, and now an outcast in the very town that had once worshipped him. The sun rose high over the prairie, burning away the last of the morning mist. Ilara stood not in the shadow of the cabin, but in front of it, Silas by her side. The stolen claim was now hers, her birthright restored. Her family's names were cleared, their story now known to all. She was no longer the abandoned one, the broken thing. She was Ilara, a name spoken with respect, with awe. The woman who had single-handedly brought down the king of the territory. She looked at Silas, at the man who had used her, guided her, and ultimately trusted her. He hadn't just given her refuge. He had returned her heritage and given her the tools to forge her own justice. He had waited, not to be her savior, but to witness her become her own. He reached out and took her hand. It wasn't a claim of ownership. It was a bond of partnership. a quiet promise between two survivors who had walked through the fire and found each other in the ashes. The world was wide open before them, a blank page on which they could finally write their own story, together. They tried to bury her story in the dust, but some truths refuse to die. They echo in the canyons and whisper on the wind, a reminder that justice, no matter how long it's denied, will always find its way home. If you believe in stories where the silenced finally find their voice and the forgotten are remembered, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell, because there are a lot more echoes out there just waiting to be heard.